All right, so why do we need gurus? Today we're doing a section from stories from the Vedas. We're going to describe the story of Vidura approaching Maitreya. So this is the 7th of November, 2019, Stories from the Vedas. Vidura approaches Maitreya. And this is, of course, a story that describes why it is that we need gurus, why it was that Maitreya was approached by Vidura, and in general, why it is that we need to make an effort to learn spiritual knowledge from a person. Because generally, and many people are of the opinion that one can just follow their heart and come to the truth. Unfortunately, that process doesn't work. One does need to follow one's heart as far as learning who to take shelter of. But like anything else, if you want to learn a particular discipline, like mathematics, or you want to learn medicine, or you want to learn aviation, you have to approach someone who is actually a person who is qualified. And then we have to understand, well, what do we mean by qualification? So qualification is an important quality that we all have to have if we're going to be a representative of some other thing. A second, let me grab a pop screen, otherwise I'm going to really regret it. All right, so now I don't have to worry about the mic popping every time I make a P. So we want to be a representative of a particular field of information. We have to have some kind of credential. You wouldn't learn aviation from somebody who self-taught themselves. You wouldn't go only to read medical books and expect to do an operation. And similarly, for actual spiritual knowledge, we need someone who represents a particular school of understanding, and not only represents that school of understanding, but is accredited by that school of understanding. Otherwise, one-offs and self-mades don't really cut it in spiritual life. The process of spiritual life is not a helter-skelter thing. It's not a thing that you're born knowing and therefore you can be in a position to teach others. It's a thing that you learn by following a teacher yourself. So any teacher who doesn't have a teacher is automatically disqualified. And if a person has a teacher, then we want to know what school they come from. So we're actually coming from the Madhva Gaudiya Vaishnav Sampradaya, which starts with Krishna to Brahma, and then goes to Narada Muni, Vyasadeva, Madhava, and on down it comes. So each teacher has a teacher themselves. And therefore, we follow and understand spiritual life because we're following a group of people who are keeping a consistent philosophy. Not that the philosophy is just whatever anybody thinks at the time. All right. So today's talk is about Vidura approaching Maitreya. We discover actually that in this story, Krishna wanted to remove his entire dynasty from the earth. Krishna himself had lived on this earth for about 130 some odd years, and now it was time for him to leave the earth. And because he wanted to leave the earth, he also didn't want to leave behind his dynasty, who was very powerful. And he felt they would create all kinds of issues in the earth if they were left to their own devices, because there was no one that was equal to them in strength and power of military ability. So he wanted to remove his dynasty, which he actually did. That's a whole story in itself. I'm not going to get in on that tangent. But there was a war in Prabhasa Kshetra, which basically annihilated Krishna's entire dynasty. And Krishna then went to take rest under a tree, an Ashwatha tree. And while he was sitting there and thinking, who should arrive but Uddhava? Uddhava is an interesting character in the Vedic literature, because Uddhava looks exactly like Krishna. He's not Krishna, but he looks like Krishna. He's a little younger than Krishna, but he looks just like Krishna. And when the gopis saw Uddhava, they thought, who is this person that looks just like Krishna? Of course, Uddhava was going to Vrindavan to be a messenger for Krishna in that particular episode. But Uddhava was one of Krishna's confidants, so Krishna was very happy to see Uddhava. Krishna had actually given Uddhava instructions that soon the age of Kali Yuga was coming. After Krishna leaves the world, then the age of Kali comes in. Krishna's in that period of time between Dwapara Yuga and Kali Yuga. And when Krishna officially leaves the planet, then Kali Yuga officially is ushered in. Kali Yuga is the worst of the four ages. So each age has its own properties, and progressively Satya Yuga's up here, and then Treta Yuga's there, and then Dwapara Yuga's here, and Kali Yuga's at the rock bottom. In Kali Yuga, people are completely indifferent to spiritual life, almost completely indifferent. And therefore, the entire atmosphere in Kali Yuga is surcharged with all kinds of undesirable things. All right, so Krishna was planning to leave, and he told Uddhava that soon Kali Yuga is coming, so you go to Badarik Ashram, which is in the north of India. It's very cold up there. In fact, Badarik Ashram is a temple where it's only open for a few months during the summer because it's too cold there. And they when they close the temple for the winter, which will be several months, they put a ghee lamp there, and people say that from a distance you can hear people singing in that temple, even though there's no humans there. At any rate, the idea is that Krishna asked Uddhava to go there, to Badarik Ashram. And Uddhava didn't follow Krishna's instructions. Instead, he knew that Krishna would be at Prabhasa, and eventually Krishna went to the Sarasvati River, and that's where Uddhava caught up to Krishna. And Krishna was happy to see Uddhava. And they talked some, and just as Krishna and Uddhava started talking, Maitreya arrived on the scene. Maitreya was a sage, and Maitreya was very knowledgeable, but he wasn't a very dear and deep devotee like Uddhava was. So Krishna was happy to see Uddhava, and not so much focused on Maitreya. But the questions that Uddhava asked Krishna were questions that made, or in other words, gave Maitreya a depth of understanding of spiritual life that actually Maitreya lacked. So this conversation between Krishna and Uddhava was really mostly for the benefit of Maitreya. So there were only three people there: Krishna, Uddhava, and Maitreya. And at the end, then Krishna gets ready to depart the world. And Uddhava is thinking that he will go to Bhadarika, which is what Krishna had originally told him to do. And while Krishna has now left, Maitreya and Uddhava separate, and Maitreya goes to Hardwar. But Uddhava stays there, and at that point, Vidura comes on the scene. He's come on the scene after Krishna has left, and he's come on the scene after Maitreya has left. So it's just now Uddhava and Vidura. Vidura is an older devotee, and of course he is the direct son of Vyasadeva by a maidservant. He's the brother of Dhritarastra and the brother of Pandu, but because he was not born from a royal queen, he was not considered royalty, although he was very advanced in knowledge. And so he was seen in the royal court as someone who would give advice. In fact, he constantly tried to give advice to Dhritarastra. And mostly Dhritarashtra ignored his advice. Even though he solicited Vidura's advice, Dhritarashtra couldn't follow Vidura's advice. And eventually, Vidura was insulted by Dhritarashtra's son, by Duryodhana. And Vidura then took the opportunity, because he could see that any more communication with either Dhritarashtra or with Duryodhana was pointless, that he would go on pilgrimage. And he took the occasion of the insult by Duryodhana as his checkout cue. And he left, and he began to go on pilgrimage all over various holy places in India. And he was completely gone during the entire battle of Kurukshetra. Later on, he would not come back into the association until this point where now Uddhava has just separated from Krishna and from Maitreya. And Vidura asks Uddhava about spiritual life. So Uddhava doesn't exactly describe spiritual life to Vidura, but instead he describes the destruction at the Kurukshetra war and eventually the destruction of the entire dynasty at the Prabhasa Kshetra, where Krishna's entire dynasty was destroyed by itself. And once he does that, then Vidura asks him, please instruct me on spiritual life. But Vidura is much younger. Uddhava is much younger than Vidura. So as a result, Vidura defers giving instructions to Vidura, and he says, you please go meet Maitreya, because he was also there when Krishna was speaking about spiritual life to me. So you should hear from Maitreya because he's older, and I should go to Bhadarika, which is what Krishna told me to do. So, okay, this is what happens. Then Uddhava departs, heading for Bhadarika, and Vidura departs, and he heads for Hardwar, where Maitreya has gone. So there, Vidura approaches Maitreya, and he asks Maitreya a number of questions. He asks him, what is real happiness? How do I perform devotional service? Tell me about how the universe is created. How is it that Krishna is the master of all mystic powers? He asks about characteristics of Krishna and why Krishna always works for the welfare of the cows and the brahmanas. And he asks about how the Supreme Lord sets up the universe with so many different planets, with different karmic circumstances, so that each place has its specific kind of inhabitants with a certain kind of karma. And then he asks about the nature of the living entities. What are they actually like? He talks about Vedavyas and Vedavyasa's work. What was Vedavyas trying to do with the Vedas? And in the end, he asks that, please, Maitreya, you explain to me Krishna's pastimes. So it's this conversation between Maitreya and Vidura, which comprise a big section of Srimad Bhagavatam. It's those two devotees talking with one another. We have Vidura asking questions and Maitreya answering those questions. And in this way, we see this is how spiritual life in general works. That we have a spiritual master and we have a disciple. The disciple tries to learn about spiritual life from the spiritual master. Being a spiritual master is not a position that one has just because they're very materially erudite. Being a spiritual master means one has to be surrendered to the process of spiritual life. One has to not only understand it, one has to be practicing it. And as we mentioned before, spiritual master also has to have his own spiritual master. If a spiritual master has not been trained, then he cannot actually be a spiritual master. The process of spiritual life is very deep. And because it's very deep, it's easy to misunderstand it. People who read the Vedas on their own will inevitably become confused. There's just no two ways about it. The literature is too vast, and there's too much of the Vedas that really does not focus on the real brass tacks of what spiritual life is about. Instead, it focuses on what we call pravrti marg, the process of material devotion, not material devotion, but material activities to gain a materially good position in the world. So in the Vedas, there are yajnas, or various sacrifices that are recommended, approaching demigods. There are things one should do to ward off various kinds of bad karma, and things one should do to live a very clean and hygienic life. And if one does those, we will get good karma and enjoy. But this is not the real purpose of the Vedas. However, probably 95% of the Vedas does discuss basically this approach, which is called pravrti marg, the path of enjoyment. But that remaining 5%, that's where we hear nivriti marg, the path of genuine devotion. So devotees are not trying to become materially happy. That's not their goal. Devotees are not trying to approach the Supreme Lord, so the Supreme Lord will give them material happiness. They're not doing that either. They're just approaching the Supreme Lord to serve the Supreme Lord, and that is what devotional service is all about. So unless you have a spiritual master, 99 times out of 100, you will miss the point in studying the Vedas and come away with this understanding that we should really just be doing various kinds of pious work so that we can enjoy either in this world or in the heavenly planets, which is, as we were saying before, not the real purpose of the Vedas. So this is why we need a guru. And we need a guru who can analyze us and understand what our shortcomings are, and interact with us in such a way that we will not be trapped by our own bad habits. In many lifetimes, we go from one kind of situation to another, and in each and every lifetime, we develop habits of thinking, habits of action, and various other kinds of bad habits mostly. And these are carried over into another lifetime, and these are called technically samskaras. So what happens in one lifetime, we carry it over to another lifetime. And we have a certain way of fearing certain things, a certain way of wanting various kinds of material things. We have a way of being frustrated by certain things. We have a way of being completely bewildered by certain things. These are all part of our journey through many lives. And so the spiritual master understands that and helps us to get around it. And the spiritual master, a living spiritual master in the here and now, is someone who can recognize when we've missed the point. You can read Vedic literature and think you understand it, but actually you've misunderstood it. And if you're going to read a book, no matter how well that book is written, you can miss the point or misunderstand the book. But a person, a real live person in the here and now, can actually recognize that you've missed the point. And that person can therefore make it possible to redress or to rephrase what your misconceptions are and to purify you, to give you the right conception. And this is again why we need a spiritual master. And as far as the qualifications of a spiritual master, we just said the spiritual master has to have their own spiritual master. They've had to surrender to their spiritual master. They have to understand the Vedas and be able to make it very clear, not only to themselves, but to anyone who asks, what is and what is not actually the path of devotion. And to find a spiritual master, one has to understand what devotion is to begin with. Otherwise, one will find a teacher who will teach either some material science or a teacher who will teach some kind of piety, how to be philanthropic or something like that, or how to open hospitals, plant trees, and feed the poor, all of which are not bad items, but that's not the goal of spiritual life. The goal of spiritual life is to understand how to dedicate one's life to God. The other things can help, but if we don't have the primary goal, all these other things we do will just be a distraction. So the spiritual master has to actually follow the teachings, and the spiritual master has to be expert and purified to the point where he can inspire people to do things which normally they wouldn't do. The path of spiritual life in the beginning is, at least it seems, uphill. We do things that we normally wouldn't do. We refrain from doing things we normally would do. And we need that motivation to go over the hump. But once we actually get deep into spiritual life, we begin to realize that we like the things that are actually good for us. And we find ourselves not so concerned about things which are bad for us that once we were completely addicted to. Now we're no longer like that. Now, when a disciple approaches a spiritual master, the disciple has to approach in the correct mood. One cannot approach the spiritual master with challenging questions. One should certainly have questions. But if one is doubtful of the spiritual master, then there won't be any real transfer of knowledge. And of course, if one doesn't even know what a spiritual master is or what a spiritual master should teach, then certainly one will not benefit from the association of a spiritual master, because one will be looking for the wrong things in a guru. One will be looking for someone who's flashy, someone who can speak eloquently, someone who's erudite, or someone who has some mystic ability. All these things are the wrong qualities to be on the look for in a guru. The actual good qualities that one should be on the look for is actually being able to put the spiritual knowledge in a very simple way that's easy to understand, and a person who actually follows those teachings themselves. They don't just talk about them or teach them, they also follow them. And the guru is someone who inspires people to change their lives because they feel that genuine happiness and a spiritual force that comes from someone who's genuinely following spiritual life. They may or may not be erudite. They may or may not be a slick talker. They may or may not have money. They may or may not be able to produce mystic magic of some kind or another. These things, again, are irrelevant to who and who is not a guru. But when the disciple approaches, the disciple should approach humbly. The disciple should certainly ask questions so that their doubts and confusions can be erased. And the disciple should be ready to offer service to the spiritual master. If the disciple is not ready to do these things, then there won't be an exchange of any genuine spiritual knowledge. It's described in the Srimad Bhagavatam that both the spiritual master and the disciple have to be qualified. If both the spiritual master and the disciple are qualified, then a genuine transfer of spiritual knowledge occurs. Otherwise, if the spiritual master is not qualified, the disciple will just be misled. If the disciple is not qualified, then the spiritual master is just wasting his time. The disciple is not going to follow anyway. All right, so that's kind of mostly what I wanted to cover today. Any questions or any realizations? Use, please, the little microphone there. Can you use the microphone?
Thank you. That was a nice talk of yours. I believe one can do spiritual practice and physical practice, but they are not the same. One is less permanent, and one is more permanent. That being spiritual practice being beneficial for the long run, and physical practice for the short run. I wanted to say that a guru is very necessary for the spiritual seeker to develop beyond his own ability to develop, but not limited to the disciple's ability to progress. So, and it's usually said that the guru comes when the disciple is ready. A ready disciple shouldn't go to a false guru, or a worthy disciple shouldn't go to any false guru.
Right.
Should be able to distinguish between them. And so should a real guru should be able to distinguish between disciples that are worthy or unworthy.
Yeah, all these things have to be done, and that's why we have the Vedic literatures, which at least give us the basic information of what is a true guru and what is a true disciple, and what's the right way to have the disciple approach the guru, and what the disciple hopes to genuinely get from the spiritual master. So if those things are all at least basically understood, then one will come to find the right guru. If those things aren't understood, then the idea of a disciple looking for a guru will just be a crapshoot. They'll get whatever they get, because they don't know what they're looking for, to be honest with you, from the beginning. So, as Prabhupada describes that if one doesn't know what gold is, then someone can swindle them with fool's gold. And there are many people who describe themselves as gurus of some type or another, but they genuinely are not following a tradition. They're not part of a school. They have not submitted themselves to a teacher. They're not describing the process of giving your heart completely to God. They're describing some other process. And they actually don't know what the Vedas are really saying. So, therefore, if one approaches one of those gurus and doesn't have an idea in their mind of what they're really looking for, they could certainly be taken in by such a person.
Thank you. Hare Krishna.
All right. So, I'm going to end here. This is Stories from the Vedas, and today we talked about Vidura approaching Maitreya. Although in one sense Vidura was quite advanced, he wanted to discuss the process of spiritual life, and so he was sent by Uddhava to Maitreya. Maitreya was older, and Vidura was older, so Uddhava did not feel it was appropriate to instruct Vidura himself. Rather, he suggested that Vidura approach Maitreya. And a big portion of Srimad Bhagavatam is the further discussions between Vidura and Maitreya. So this is Stories from the Vedas, November 7th. 2019, and we're here every Thursday with a presentation. Thank you all very much. Hare Krishna.